You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. Recently, I was invited to be a guest on the History Dispatches podcast. This is a daily podcast that discusses a wide range of historical events. The hosts are a father and son team, Matt and McKinley Breen. On occasion, they invite guests to discuss a particular event. I was invited to discuss the Battle of Bunker Hill. What follows is their recording of our discussion. I should note that ordinarily their episodes last about 15 minutes. Because I have a tendency to go on and on with anyone who will listen to me talk about history, this episode lasts nearly an hour. But I think it's a great talk about the Battle of Bunker Hill, and I hope you enjoy it.
Following the start of the American Revolution at the Battle of Lexington and Concord, the colonists took up arms, besieging the British Army in Boston. However, the first real contest of arms would take place 3 months later at Bunker Hill. The British were convinced that the colonial militia would never stand up and fight against regular troops. But the Americans proved them wrong. Despite making a few rookie mistakes, they held their own. Today, we discuss the events of that day with the help of Mike Troy of the American Revolution podcast. This is the story of the Battle of Bunker Hill.
Incoming transmission.
Hello, and welcome to History Dispatches. My name is Matt. I am here with my son, McKinley.
That's me.
Hi, Mick. How are you doing today?
I might sound a little different, and it's because we have a special guest, so I'm in a different room today.
Yeah, we're doing a little Zoom because we are doing a special podcast. We're doing one on one of the earliest and most important moments of the American Revolution. And you know what? We got someone else to come on the show and tell us about this because that way then we don't have to do the work.
Let's be honest, he can school us for an American Revolution, backwards, forwards, front ways, sideways, whatever.
So we have with us today Mike Troy from the American Revolution podcast. It is a awesome show that has been going. We were just talking 8 years as of just this month. So he is like the expert, and he is going to talk to us about the Battle of Bunker Hill. And Mike, thank you for being with us.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
Now, I've known Mike for a few years now, and like I said, he has a great show, the American Revolution podcast, which I highly recommend. And I want to point out that a link to his show is in our show notes. And if you want to, just look it up, the American Revolution podcast by Mike Troy, wherever you get your podcasts, and you can find it, and you can have yourself weeks, maybe months of fun in catching up with what happened 250 years ago. Anyhow, like I said, we are going to talk about one of the earliest, most important moments of the American Revolution, and that is the Battle of Bunker Hill, which actually never took place there, if I'm correct. But Mike, this is your show. So, hey, thank you for coming on, and you take it away.
Well, thanks. Happy to be here. Yeah, Bunker Hill, it was probably the first major battle of the American Revolution, or at least the major field battle. Lexington and Concord, which we all think of as the first battle, was kind of a running firefight more than anything else. But when Lexington and Concord did happen in April 19th, 1775, that was what began the clash of arms between the New England militia and the British Army. And by the evening of that night of April 19th, the British Army was back in the city of Boston, and they were besieged by tens of thousands of New England militia. And for the most part, for the next month or two, both sides kind of held their positions and didn't do much of anything. So we have about 4,000 or 5,000 British regulars in the city of Boston, surrounded by between 10 and 20,000 New England militia. The number varied at times as people came and went. There were some very minor skirmishes, usually out in Boston Harbor or on one of the various islands or places like that, but there really wasn't any direct contact between the two armies in any large way. People who are familiar with Boston today you can drive or walk right into Boston. In 1775, the geography was very different. Boston was really a peninsula, and there was only one small area that was only a few feet wide, maybe a couple dozen feet wide, where you could enter or leave the city without using a boat. So the two sides were pretty much separated by water. and that's what kept the lines apart. So what changed in June of 1775 that led to the battle that we're here to discuss today? Thomas Gage, who was the British commander in Boston, felt that he was horribly outnumbered, outgunned, and was panic writing to people in London saying, please, please send me more soldiers, guns, artillery, everything. We need them. Of course, communications between the US and Britain took weeks or months. So getting a message across and a message back, plus time to react to the original message, would take many months.
Quick question, Mike. Do you think that the British and the Americans were literally on this thought process that, oh, someone's got to figure this all out and we're all going to go home? Or were they like, this is a war?
New Englanders mostly thought, yeah, this is war.
Okay.
There was a movement in the Continental Congress, primarily from people from other colonies like Pennsylvania, that thought because there had been a clash of arms, Britain would know we were serious about our rights. And this would lead to a compromise because British authorities would know that it would be far cheaper to reach a reasonable compromise, basically bringing things back to the way they were in the early 1760s, than it would be to fight a full-fledged war with the colonies. So this clash of arms was going to lead to a negotiated peace. And that's why during the siege of Boston, the Americans referred to the British Army as the Parliamentary Army, meaning that they were the army of Parliament and that the British colonies were actually being loyal to the king, who was the defender of English liberties, and that they were trying to basically reproduce the divisions that existed in the English Civil War a century earlier, where King Charles was fighting against Parliament. They were essentially, by doing this, appealing to the king. They were saying, hey, king, Parliament has been completely out of control for a few years now. You probably didn't notice, but they really have just been going crazy. Why don't you step in and be the defender of English liberties and save us from all this? Now, of course, people knew the king knew what was going on, but by putting on this theater, they were basically giving the British government a face-saving way of stepping in and coming to a reasonable compromise. And I think that's what a lot of the Dove side of the Continental Congress was hoping to do when they sent over the Olive Branch petition, which happened around this same time.
Okay, thank you.
So, yeah, as I said, the New England colonists were all in on the fighting, and they were just going to fight until, somebody else like the Continental Congress resolved this thing. They had been threatening a full-scale battle for years before Lexington and Concord actually broke out. And a lot of this was because of the Intolerable Acts, which closed Boston Harbor and took away their government and all these things in 1774, which was a result of the Boston Tea Party. So they were very angry, and there were several occasions where guns were drawn and the two sides were facing off against each other, but no blood was shed until we finally reached Lexington Green, where blood is actually shed. So the people of New England had this whole time to build up this head of steam against the British Army. And so when blood was shed, there was this whole early warning system that went all across New England. Everybody picked up their guns. They'd been training for months. They came and they were ready to start fighting this war. And they were going to fight until they got what they wanted.
And so when the Battle Bunker Hill comes up, they're ready for this. Maybe not militarily or anything like that, but I guess, their psyche probably is, well, this has got to happen sooner or later. So here we go.
Yeah, I mean, they're ready to face down the British troops, whether this untrained militia is qualified to do so. Both sides, leaders of both sides have their doubts, but this is where we're going to find out.
Gotcha.
But as I said, the British were heavily outnumbered. They were facing this huge surrounding army, and they were really afraid to do anything. At least that was kind of general gauge. Now, if you talk to anybody in London, they will tell you one regiment of British soldiers could destroy 100 regiments of militia, because militia are ill-disciplined, ill-trained. They'll run at the first sight of a serious advance and all this stuff. And generally, they were right. You have a very hard time. You always have a very hard time with militia standing toe-to-toe in the field against regulars.
And British troops, they're good. They're not lame or anything like that. British regulars are no joke, correct?
British regulars are very highly trained to obey orders, to ignore bullets flying at them, because that's what you had to do in an 18th century army. You had to have men who would stand in line, be observed by the enemy seemingly oblivious to the bullets flying at them, uncaring about it, and attacking and advancing regardless of what was happening to them. So yes, the British soldiers, these, if you joined the British Army, you were a lifer. Nobody joined the British regulars for 2 years. If you were in, and usually until you died, or you were lucky and got so old and enfeebled that you could retire, but it was usually 20, 30 years later. So yeah, the British were highly disciplined, great troops. And so everybody in London said, what are you talking about? 10,000 militia? You should be able to take 500 men and crush them. And you have 5,000. So what's the problem? Gage was basically writing back saying, no, you don't realize these guys are standing and fighting. So what Britain ends up doing is sending over some reinforcements. I think Gage had about 4,000 men. They sent over another 1,000 or so. And with those 1,000, they sent 3 new generals, all of whom talked to the people in London and said, oh, yeah, with these numbers, I could easily crush the Americans. To people who are fans of the American Revolution, they will know the names of these 3 generals very well. The most senior general was General Howe, who became commander-in-chief after Gage was recalled. The next senior officer was General Henry Clinton, who took over as commander of armed forces when Howe was revoked. And the third most senior general was General John Burgoyne, who was a major field officer and the commander at the surrender of Saratoga.
Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne, right?
He is known today as Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne. I've been told actually that was not a nickname that was used during his time. But yeah, so these are all 3 very impressive generals who are going to have a very impressive career in front of them. But right now, these are the 3 junior officers to the commanding general, Thomas Gage. But they all came over full of ideas that they were going to, that Gage was somehow a fraidy cat. In fact, some people called him Granny Gage behind his back. Didn't know what he was doing, that if you just showed a little push against these colonists, we would have this thing done.
Chip up. Get out there, lads.
Yeah, just need to step up. So they came over with all these ideas about, all right, well, we've got to go on the advance and do something against these colonists. And Gage was like, all right, you guys go ahead and do it. I'm not doing it. And so they came up with a plan together to occupy the heights to the north of Boston and to the south of Boston. High ground is very important in 18th century combat because your bullets don't really, or your musket balls don't have a lot of power behind them. And so being up a lot up higher means you have a far greater range of fire against your enemy. The heights to the south of Boston were known as Dorchester Heights. The heights to the north of Boston were actually out on the Charlestown Peninsula, which was, again, separated by water from the city of Boston. Those heights were known as the Bunker Hill Heights. So the British in June, which is about, 2-3 weeks after these 3 generals have arrived, plan to occupy Dorchester Heights. And they're going to do this, I think, on June 20th. They plan this several weeks in advance. They don't do a very good job about keeping it a secret. There's a merchant from New Hampshire that is in the city of Boston. He hears about this planned occupation of Dorchester Heights, doesn't really do much about it, goes home, sails back to New Hampshire, mentions it to some people here. Yeah, things are gonna really heat up in Boston soon. The British are gonna occupy Dorchester Heights. And they're like, you might want to tell someone about this. They rush a messenger back down to Cambridge to tell the Americans what's going on. The Americans have to decide what to do. They decide that they're going to occupy Bunker Hill rather than Dorchester Heights ahead of the time that the British do this. They do this because they think it will be more defensible than Dorchester is. Dorchester would be a much easier land battle for the British. Bunker Hill requires them crossing Boston Harbor by boat and then marching up this hill to get to them. So they think if we occupy Bunker Hill, that will get the British attention. They will forget about Dorchester Heights and they will come after us. And then, of course, they're exactly right about that. So on the night of June 16th, the Americans, under the command of a Massachusetts colonel named William Prescott, take about 1,200 men onto the Charlestown Peninsula up to the top of Bunker Hill and decide where they want to start digging in. Now, as many people know, they do not start digging in on Bunker Hill. but they move about part way down the hill where there's another rise known as Breed's Hill, and that's where they decide to build their defensive positions. The reasoning for this is kind of unknown. There are no good official records about exactly what happened. As I said, there was a Massachusetts colonel who was in charge of this whole thing, Colonel Prescott. That night, there was a general from Connecticut who came over with them, a guy named Israel Putnam. General Putnam was an older guy. He had been one of the most aggressive officers during the siege so far. He had done a whole bunch of little skirmishes with the British. At one point, he took a couple hundred men when a small British ship, warship, got stuck on a sandbar near the shore. He took about 200 men who literally waded up to their waists in the water with muskets firing at this ship, trying to take it over. And they actually did. They managed to capture the ship and steal all the cannons off it and burn it to the ground. So yeah, he was a pretty aggressive guy. So he comes over with the rest of these troops. He doesn't try to take command. Even though he's a general and the commander's a colonel, he says, I'm kind of here as a volunteer advisor. Most people think that he was the one who suggested they build on Breed's Hill rather than Bunker Hill, because it's a little more of an aggressive position. It's a little bit closer to the enemy, a whole bunch of things. Most people think it was a stupid idea because it actually put them within range of British cannons and made it less distance that the British had to cover to get to them. But in any event, that's where they build their redoubt and their lines. Now, they're doing this at night, and they have to do it by morning because they realize the British are going to know what's up as soon as they see them across the water and will react to it. In fact, the British find out almost immediately in the middle of the night that they're doing this. General Clinton is out for an evening walk. He hears the noise over on Bunker Hill, checks it out with a telescope, realizes that the militia is up to something, and warns the senior staff. They talk about it. They decide not to do anything that night because they'd have to do a water crossing at night without any planning against an unknown enemy of unknown size. And, after all, these guys are just amateurs anyway. Let's wait and see what's going on in the morning, and then we'll discuss our plan of attack. So they get a good night's sleep while the Americans are digging in. The next morning, they see that the Americans have pretty much finished a redoubt and a defensive line up on top of Breed's Hill, and they have to decide what to do about it. There's a little bit of fighting between the generals. General Clinton, who spent a lot of time fighting with or serving with the Prussian army and Frederick the Great, learned a lot of the advanced Prussian tactics, and one of their favorites was pincer movements to go around behind the enemy and cut them off and surround them and destroy them. So he wanted to take a bunch of British ships, land further up the peninsula behind the American lines, cut them off from any line of retreat back to the mainland, and destroy the army or force their surrender. General Howe, however, said, none of that's necessary. Let's just do a frontal assault against Bunker Hill. These are amateurs. We're not fighting the Prussian army here. We're fighting a bunch of yahoos with muskets. So a frontal assault will just look more impressive. It'll scare the enemy, and they'll probably just run off. General Howe is the more senior officer. He's given command of the mission, so he gets to decide what they do, and this is what they decide to do. So they spend most of the morning shuttling British regulars across the water to the Charlestown Peninsula. This takes many hours. The Americans are seeing what's going on during this whole time, and they're building up their defenses. One would think they would bring more reinforcements in, that they don't. Because the Americans were given intelligence that the British were really after Dorchester Heights and not Bunker Hill, the overall commander of the American army at this time, a man named Artemus Ward, did not want to commit his entire army to Bunker Hill because he thought the British might just do this as a distraction while they send their main army to seize Dorchester Heights. So he doesn't send any reinforcements. And in fact, the Americans lose a lot of soldiers over the course of the night because these guys have been digging all night. They're exhausted. They are not seasoned professional soldiers. And a lot of them think, well, I've done my duty. I've dug the hole. Let somebody else come and fight here. And a lot of them wander off. So he loses about half of his men.
Did the Americans bring any artillery up there?
They did. but they did not plan for it very well. It was part of the problem. When they dug the embankments, the defensive lines the night before, they didn't put any room in for cannons. And by the time the cannons arrived the next morning, they had already sent their entrenching tools back to the mainland. And Prescott did not want to send men to go get the entrenching tools because the men he had sent to return the entrenching tools never came back. And he assumed if he just sent more men to get entrenching tools, that they would never come back. So they tried digging out with their hands for a while, and that didn't work very well. Finally, somebody had the bright idea to fill the cannon with solid shot, put it up against the mud wall, and just fire a big old hole through the wall. And so that's what they did. So they only had that one cannon that was actually in the main line. The others, they mostly kept back on the American right flank, closer to Bunker Hill. So they were a little bit further behind. General Israel Putnam kind of took charge of this whole thing, setting up these cannons so that they would protect the American right flank. And so they effectively did that job during the battle.
Thank you.
So the Americans are watching the British lines get larger and larger, and General Howe delays the attack even longer because he wants his reserves brought over before he even begins the battle, because he doesn't want to get caught where he's forced to pull back and he doesn't have reserves to throw in. So it's really closer to like 3 or 4 in the afternoon before the battle actually begins. And as I said, the Americans have mostly been losing soldiers this whole time. Even once Artemus Ward decides that he will send some reinforcements, most of the reinforcements refuse to go. And that's because the British Navy brought up several warships close to Charlestown Neck. Charlestown Neck is the relatively narrow area of land that makes it possible to get onto the Charlestown Peninsula, unless you're coming by water. So with those ships there, if anybody tried to cross over Charlestown Neck, the British would just fire grape shot and chain shot and cut them in half, literally chop their bodies in half. So that kind of intimidated a lot of the militia who refused to cross. There were a few hundred that did get across, most memorably about 200 New Hampshire militia under Colonel John Stark, who later became a Continental General. Stark came over with his men, and also there were a few hundred others who did make it over, I should say, under Charleston, but most of them just stayed up on Bunker Hill, where they had a really good view of the battle, but they did not participate at all.
How far back is Bunker Hill from Breed's Hill?
It's, I think, about 100 yards.
Okay.
100 to 200 yards, and has an elevation of about 50 yards higher than Breed's Hill.
So it's too far back for like supportive fire or anything like that.
Yeah, it's far enough back that cannons are useful, but small arms are not.
Gotcha.
Yeah, General Stark looks at this whole situation and realizes that the American left flank is just wide open. They made no attempt to protect that at all. So he takes his 200 New Hampshire militia and goes down to the American left flank, all the way down to the water line. So there's no way you can go around the American left without a boat. And he sets up his defensive lines there. So it's really, the Americans set up a great defensive line, but almost by mistake. Prescott set up this great central line, didn't really think about either of his flanks. Prescott saw the poor white right flank and got some artillery set up there to defend that. Stark saw the exposed left flank and set up defenses there. And thankfully, Howe did not try to charge too early because they had many, many hours to get all this set up and figured out. So these are the American lines when the British start their first advance around 3 or 4 o'clock. And I should say one of the first things the British do, and this is actually a little bit before the main attack, is they burn Charlestown to the ground. Charlestown consists of a few dozen, maybe 100 houses, I don't know. Not a really large area, but it's a town across the water from Boston, essentially, where a lot of really rich people lived before the war, a lot of big mansions over there. The Americans had snuck down to these houses, which were by and large had been abandoned because of the war that was going on at the moment, climbed up to the roofs of these houses and were firing on the British Army like snipers and just taking out British soldiers who were trying to form as they were getting off the ships. So they call in the British Navy, which fire carcasses and hot shot at the houses A carcass is a flammable material that's just basically fired out of a cannon to set something on fire. A hot shot is literally a cannonball that is put into a fire and superheated till it's like glowing red, again, with the idea that it will set fires. So they fire all this at the houses at Charleston and just burn it all to the ground.
I'm just thankful that the carcasses aren't really carcasses, because that would be disgusting.
Makes me wonder where they got the name from in the Middle Ages, though, doesn't it?
Good point.
In the Middle Ages, you would throw dead cows over castle walls to spread disease.
Oh yeah, no, they did that as late as the French Indian War.
And I've seen that on Monty Python and the Holy Grail. They shoot a cow on someone.
There you go. So yeah, the British take out Charlestown, and then they begin their assault on Bunker Hill, actually Breed's Hill. In the first attack, what Howe hopes to do is what they call amuse the enemy in the main center of the line, which is basically a bunch of British regulars marching up in line saying, look at me, don't pay attention to what's going on somewhere else. So that, they're firing at the enemy, but they're not really making a huge effort to take the line. They're just trying to take the attention of the defenders while they're doing something else elsewhere. And the thing they're trying to do elsewhere is that they want to attack the American left flank and get around behind them. Now, as we've said, Colonel Stark and his New Hampshire militia have defended the left flank, but it's a few hundred men. They're not really dug in. They're behind a wooden picket fence, which does not stop musket balls. And they figure they'll be able to overrun these militia pretty easily. Stark is, however, a very experienced officer. He's fought in the French and Indian War. He knows what he's doing. He puts a little stick about 30 yards in front of his lines. And he tells his men, do not fire until the enemy pass this stick. The big mistake that most inexperienced soldiers make is they see an enemy marching to them. They get scared and they shoot when the enemy is still 150, 200 yards out or something ridiculous. These muskets really have an accurate line of fire of 50 yards. They might be able to hit somebody standing in a huge line at 100 yards, but it really doesn't get accurate until they're really close. So what he wants to avoid happening is having his militia fire. It takes a good 20, 30 seconds to reload their musket. In that 20 or 30 seconds, most regulars can easily cover the 100 yards and be bayoneting you to death before you're ready to fire again. So he wants to avoid this. He tells them, do not fire until they get within about 30 yards of your lines. This works. The militia heed Colonel Stark's orders. The British get in very close. They have a very narrow field which they can cross. It's basically a beach area between a hill and the water. So they can't really create a very wide line that they can march through. It's a very rocky area, so it's very hard to keep their lines straight and steady. But they do march in. The Americans give them a devastating fire. The way Revolutionary War soldiers will usually fire is they have three lines. So there'll be three lines of men. There'll be a first line, a second line, a third line. The first line will fire, and they will begin starting to reload. The second line will then step up and fire, then they will reload. Then the third line will fire, and they will reload. So the idea of this is, even though it takes 20 or 30 seconds to reload your gun, if you have three different lines firing, you basically have volleys of fire coming at you every 8 to 10 seconds. So the British are marching into this, and of course British soldiers are taught, you just keep marching, doesn't matter how heavy the fire is, you just keep marching into it. So they basically walk into a meat grinder, and they take horrendous casualties from these militia who will not give up. We see, I think, more than 50% of the forces that were advancing on this line are killed or wounded. And in some regiments, you see up to 90% casualties. I mean, it really is a meat grinder. It really is horrific. And they advance and fall back several times. And, after the third and fourth attempt, they're basically having trouble crawling over the dead bodies of their comrades to even get at the enemy. It becomes a huge mess. So essentially, they all give up and pull back. And General Howe has to decide what to do. And his decision is, well, we're basically going to reform our ranks, and we're going to advance again. are going to advance against the center and the American left, just like we did before, except this time we're not just going to amuse the enemy in the center. We're really going to charge up the hill and take this center line. Colonel Prescott has basically given similar orders to Stark about having their men hold their rate of fire until the British are very close. The popular story is he says, don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. We're not really sure if that was really said during the time of the battle. It didn't appear in any contemporary records. It only shows up decades later. But he did obviously make clear somehow that they should not fire until the British got very close. And so the center line here on Breed's Hill opens up a devastating fire on the British. And again, the British are having all sorts of problems advancing up the hill. One of the problems is that this hill in peacetime was used by a bunch of farmers, and they'd put these little like 6-inch high stone walls to mark off their various fields so that your neighbor farmer didn't get into your field. So the British are tripping over these things. Their lines are breaking up. Some of the soldiers are firing early without orders, and then they have to stop to reload. So the lines are becoming a huge mess really quickly. But they do take devastating casualties, and they have to fall back a second time. The fire is just devastating for the British. The Americans also do something that the British find very ungentlemanly. They have riflemen who are targeting officers on the field. Typically, rifles were not used in battle for several reasons. One of which is that it took about a minute to reload a rifle, and a minute on a battlefield is an eternity. The second reason is that the bullet in a rifle has to be big enough to touch all sides of the barrel in order to get the spin, to get its accuracy when it comes out, which means unlike a musket ball, which can be much smaller than the barrel it's being thrown into, the bullet in a rifle is very tight. So what happens, of course, with old-timey gunpowder is that it leaves a residue on the barrel. And so after about 6 or 7 shots, you can't get another bullet down the rifle to fire. It just becomes too fouled, as they call it. And the rifle is useless until it's actually cleaned, which means you have to go off and pour water and clean it and scrub all the residue out of the barrel. Because a rifle had a much slower rate of fire and was essentially useless after 5 or 6 shots, soldiers didn't use them. But the Americans, of course, had them because they used them for hunting. And you can shoot the head of an officer the easiest as you can shoot the head of a deer. So they're using them, and they are picking off officers. Officers are falling at even a much higher rate than the soldiers are. I've read something like 80 to 90% of all officers were killed or wounded by the end of the battle. And amazingly, General Howe was untouched. And it wasn't because he was like hiding in the back or something. He was advancing with his men, and he had about 10 aides around him, lieutenants and captains and folks like that. All of his aides were killed or wounded. He was left untouched. So figure that out. But anyway, they'd taken these huge numbers of casualties, and Howe was getting just really ticked off that this militia is holding, essentially. So he orders his men to do something that you don't usually do. First of all, he's going to make the third charge. He tells them they're not allowed to load their muskets. The reason for this is that he doesn't want men stopping and firing. They're just going to go up as a group, charge into the redoubt, and kill everyone with a bayonet. Psychologically, for the soldiers, it's better because they're not worried about stopping and firing. They know, I have to get into that target before I can stop this killing. So he does that. The second thing he does is he marches his men up in columns rather than in a line because, as he found, the ground was so horrible that the men couldn't keep their lines. And so he creates 3 columns with gaps in between so that they can march up and essentially maintain their formation. The reason you usually don't use columns in battle is because if your enemy has cannons with solid shot, they can just shoot into the front of that column and take out as many men as the cannonball will go through. He realized that there weren't any cannons in this main redoubt, and he didn't really have to worry about that. So this is what he does for the third attack. The Americans by this time have fallen in numbers. Many have been killed, but a great many others have just left the field, retreated, run away. There's only about 200 men left in the redoubt. Those men have been up all the day before, all night digging this huge trench, so they're exhausted, and they've spent all day fighting. They haven't had any food, no water, and most importantly, no extra ammunition brought to them. They're almost all out of ammunition. What they end up doing is they find a couple of powder cartridges that are meant for a cannon, and they can break it open and just take out the gunpowder and use it in their muskets. But they don't have any musket balls, so they're just walking around looking for rocks on the ground they can throw in their musket and fire at the enemy. But they're really running out of ammunition. It's really getting desperate. The British, again, march up, try to take the redoubt. The Americans fire several very deadly volleys into the enemy. The British Marines lead the way. Their commander is killed in the charge, but his Marines actually enter the redoubt, and there is a pretty brutal hand-to-hand combat going on inside the redoubt. Somebody I haven't really spoken about yet, who is a big player in this whole thing, is a man named Joseph Warren. Warren was the president of the Provincial Congress in Massachusetts, and he was also a major general in the Massachusetts militia. He had come over around 2:00 in the afternoon that day to be a part of this whole thing. He'd been suffering from horrible migraines for several days beforehand, but he absolutely wanted to be a part of this whole thing. Again, he's a major general, and the commanding officer at the battlefield is Colonel William Prescott. But like General Putnam, General Warren comes over and says, I am not here to assume command. Use me as a volunteer officer. He essentially acts like a captain would during the battle. But during the final British assault on the redoubt, General Warren says that he will be the last man out of the redoubt and will defend it as everybody else is trying to escape. So he's fighting off how many hundred British soldiers and Marines with his sword, trying to save time for the Americans to get out of the redoubt and escape back up to Bunker Hill. He actually does make it out of the redoubt, and he's supposedly the last man out. But a few feet out of the redoubt, a British officer shoots him in the head with a pistol, and he falls dead. Just to make sure of the fact, a few British soldiers who are not in a very good mood by this time rush up on General Warren and just mutilate his body with their bayonets. He's not going to live through this thing, even if he survived the shot in the head. Most of the American casualties from the battle take place during this escape from the redoubt. They're rushing up Bunker Hill, and the British are just firing at them, shooting them in the back. And they kill several hundred soldiers at this point. By this time, it's almost night. Remember, this whole battle didn't start until 4 in the afternoon. It's getting late in the day at this point. The British Army is, as I said, been through a meat grinder. They are not in any mood to chase down the colonists as they are up on Bunker Hill by this time. The Americans withdraw across Boston Neck and basically cede the rest of Charlestown Peninsula to the British. And that technically makes this a British victory, since the British hold the ground at the end of the battle. There were several people who wrote after the battle. I think General Clinton was one of them. That one more such win as this and the war will be over. We will have lost the war. They took so many horrific casualties.
It's a classic Pyrrhic victory, right?
I think that's exactly what Pyrrhus said after he fought the Romans once. One more victory like this will surely do us in.
Yeah, there was one American general, I forget who it was, or officer, who said, I would love to sell the British the hill at a similar price.
Wow.
But yeah, there were over 1,000 British killed and wounded. It was the highest, bloodiest battle for the British for the entire American Revolutionary War. There were other battles where they had 10 times the number of soldiers engaged. They never had 1,000 killed or wounded ever again in the course of the war.
Isn't it like a third of the men that landed that day, or 30% or so, were killed or injured of the British?
Yeah, most of the soldiers that participated in the battle, I think it was like you're looking at more like 40% casualty rates.
Wow.
The numbers get skewed a little bit because shortly after the end of the third assault, which took the redoubt, General Clinton came over with about another 1,000 reinforcements because he was getting worried about what was going on. So if you count those, the numbers go down to about 30% of those engaged. But these are huge numbers. I mean, remember, the British Army in Boston has about 5,000 soldiers total. So we're talking 20% of their army dead or wounded. And they were already feeling outnumbered before this. The Americans suffer about 400 casualties, which is not nothing to sneeze at, but anytime you can inflict so much more on the enemy than you take yourself, it's kind of considered a win.
Would the British end up winning the siege of Boston?
Well, one thing that does happen as a result of the Battle of Bunker Hill is the British feel so bloodied by this battle that they give up on the idea of taking Dorchester Heights. The three generals that came around and told Gage he was being a wuss by just staying in Boston and not going out and fighting all decide after this time that it's probably a good idea not to go outside the city of Boston and fight. So they all basically sit there for the next 9 months or so. The Americans never counterattack. George Washington very much wanted to attack. He was this new general that comes about 2 weeks after Bunker Hill happens, and he says, "All right, let's go take these guys." One of the things he finds out very quickly is that the Continental Army, what became the Continental Army, had used pretty much all of its gunpowder at the Battle of Bunker Hill, and that if the British had decided to come out of Boston and attack them, they'd be able to fire a couple of volleys and they'd be done. They had no gunpowder. And so this lack of ammunition was one of the things that really kept Washington from going on the attack. Thank God, because if he had tried to do a water assault with militia against hardened British, it would have been a bloodbath in the other direction. So thankfully, Washington was restrained from his own desires by a lack of ammunition. So the suicides essentially just sat and looked at each other for the next 9 months. Washington, during this whole time, of course, was trying to get more artillery, more ammunition, and all that good stuff. You've probably heard the story about Henry Knox going to Fort Ticonderoga and bringing the train of cannon to Boston to end the siege of Boston. And he does this heroic thing, bringing these huge, heavy cannons, hundreds of miles across what's essentially wilderness, to the siege of Boston.
Yeah, that's actually on my list of topics to cover because I've always loved that story of, as you said, in the middle of winter over frozen rivers and through the wilderness, hauling these huge guns. And the British and the Americans were right about the heights, because the Americans then in the siege of Boston, they end the siege by taking some heights in the middle of the night, put the big guns up on there and basically start throwing a few cannonballs into the harbor and saying like, okay, your ships are going to go down if you don't leave. And that basically,
so stay tuned.
Yeah, stay tuned.
That's exactly what happened. Henry Knox brings these cannons. And remember Dorchester Heights, those heights that the British ended up not taking?
Yep.
Those are the heights that the Americans occupy in one night, getting all their cannons up there, building the defenses all in one night, which the British thought would be impossible. And yeah, you're right. That's what happened.
And that'll be a great story. And like I said, I've always loved that story. And so I will tell that at some point on the show.
It's a great one. But yeah, the evacuation of Boston took place in March 1776. British never came back to Massachusetts after that. The war was over for Massachusetts.
So at the end of the Battle of Bunker Hill, obviously it's a tactical or whatever a victory in the eyes. I'm using my air quotes here for the British in that they took the spot. But again, it was not a victory in the casualties they took. And they basically kind of gave up any sort of like offensive things. What was the reaction in the colonies, and what was the reaction from the British Crown or the government and so forth?
Well, as I said, the expectation among everyone, this is American leaders and British leaders, was that militia will not stand and fight against regulars in a pitched battle. And that was pretty much the only hope Britain had of winning the war. One was militia not standing against British regulars, and the second was that at least half the population will turn out and be loyalist militia for us, and neither of those things happened for them. But Bunker Hill proved that militia would stand and fight against regulars and would be perfectly able of bloodying their nose just like anybody else. It might be a little different if they're standing toe-to-toe in a field, but against the militia in a defensive position would stand and fight and would viciously bloody the British soldiers. So when that happened, the British realized that they were not going to end this war on the cheap by sending over a few thousand guys. And they end up sending tens of thousands of British regulars when they take New York City a year later. And, they realized this is going to be much more of a full-scale war. Turns out that's not even enough, but that's what their hope was.
And all it took was one guy putting a stick out there saying, don't fire till you hit this point.
Well, that's the other thing. I mean, the conventional wisdom was that American officers were not really officers. They were tinkers and tailors and stuff that just played soldier on the weekend, and that they would never make good officers, and good officers were the key to an effective army. What, again, the British didn't count on was the fact that many of these officers had fought in battle commanding companies and regiments, and they knew what officers were supposed to do from their time in the French and Indian War, before that King George's War for some of the older ones. So they did. There were officers who really knew what they were doing, and that was another big problem for the British.
I think the big thing I love about the story, and you touched on this, Mike, was the understanding that militia can be effective, especially if they're in fortifications in a situation. Because again, if you're not a regular soldier and they want you to march out and charge up against some wall somewhere under fire, that's a lot different than being like, okay, get behind this wall here and you can take some shots at the guys coming up to you. It doesn't take as much discipline and work and so forth, but it's still required. But if you do that, you can make those guys effective. And I think this showed exactly how.
That's true. And the way they found militia was really most effective through most of the war, aside from kind of manning places so that they freed up regular Continentals to go fight. When they were used in battle, the idea was to get a few shots out of them. In other words, to fire and harass the British, but not try to hold ground against the British. The idea was the British Army, when it was in full numbers, could pretty much march wherever it wanted to march. There was no American army that was going to stop them. But anytime they walked anywhere, they were going to have shots fired at them and they were going to lose some soldiers. So, it wasn't like fighting a bear, it was fighting a hive of bees. You're not going to have one enemy that you can really fight against, but you're going to be swarmed constantly by these annoyances that are slowly bleeding your forces. Washington finally learned that partway through the war and started using militia much more that way.
The other thing that I love about this story is the what ifs. I mean, if the British had just done a few different things, if they would have just done what the one guy said and go around the back, and they could have cut off a couple thousand troops or whatever it was of militia, but they elected to do the very British thing, and that's, march right down the middle sort of thing. And that's kind of amazing.
They didn't press their advantage after the battle. Like they didn't try and break out of Boston.
They didn't have as Mike said, they didn't have the will after that. They lost 20% of their troops.
Yeah, they had been so bloodied that they really couldn't do anything. And remember, even after this battle, they were outnumbered by about 2 or 3 to 1 by the surrounding enemy.
Well, Mike, is that it for the Battle of Bunker Hill?
Yeah, I think so.
It is pretty cool.
Thank you.
We have not done a battle this in depth, and that was really fun. And I thought I knew a lot about the Battle of Bunker Hill, and I knew some of the stuff, but the details you provided were just awesome. So thank you very much.
Well, sure, it's my pleasure.
Here on History Dispatches, we usually wrap things up with a bit of trivia, and I've asked Mike to give us his trivia fun for today. So, Mike, I'm going to let you finish up with trivia.
All right. Well, so I mentioned during my talk that Bunker Hill was the bloodiest battle for the British in the entire Revolutionary War. What battle was the bloodiest for the Americans?
My guess is going to be something like Brandywine, Germantown, or else maybe Camden or something like that in the South. There were some pretty nasty ones there.
I don't know my American Revolution very well, so I'm just going to say Yorktown.
Well, the answer is Camden. Matt got it.
Hey.
Yes.
Camden was almost a reverse of Bunker Hill in terms of casualty numbers. The British just completely dominated the Americans there, wiped out a bunch of American officers and soldiers, and basically sent Horatio Gates scurrying. I think he rode something like 150 miles in 2 days or something on his horse, trying to get away from the battle. Completely destroyed his reputation.
It gave the South Nathaniel Greene as a commander, which was a little bit better.
Yeah, well, the South had it rough. They, remember, the largest American loss in terms of losing soldiers was actually Charleston when it surrendered. It wasn't the bloodiest because almost all of them were taken prisoner, but the Americans lost an army of 5,000 men at Charleston when it surrendered. And then they sent Horatio Gates down a few months later with another huge army that they had to raise to defend the South, and he got slaughtered at Camden. So Greene was the third attempt to save the South, and thankfully he was able to do it.
Awesome. All righty. Well, Mike, thank you so much for being here today. This has been the Battle of Bunker Hill with Mike Troy from the American Revolution podcast. Again, look in the show notes if you want to link over to his website. Otherwise, you can just look up the American Revolution podcast by Mike Troy, and you can, like I say, have 8 years of fun to catch up on. It's a great show, and Mike knows his stuff more than anyone, so this is great. McKinley, thanks for being here. Mike, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks. It's been fun.
McKinley, I'm going to let you wrap up today.
Mike, thank you very much. And everyone, thank you so much for listening. We really appreciate it. If you want to know more about the show, check out historydispatches.com and check out Mike's show as well, American Revolution Podcast. And we just want to say, have a great day.
Transmission complete.
Thanks again for joining my discussion about the Battle of Bunker Hill on the History Dispatches podcast. My thanks to Matt and McKinley Breen for inviting me for this great discussion. If you want to learn more about the History Dispatches podcast, just go to historydispatches.com or look it up on your favorite podcast platform. Be sure to note that History Dispatches is different from another similarly named Dispatches podcast, which comes from the Journal of the American Revolution. Both of these are great podcasts, but the one we listened to today is called History Dispatches Podcast. Once again, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast.